The previous lecture in our series on ancient Near Eastern mythology focused on the Canaanites and the Hittites, two of the smaller peoples, the non-imperial peoples of the ancient Near East. And I contrasted them with the Egyptians and the cultures of Mesopotamia, the great superpowers of the Near East. I referred to connections between these powers and to the relevance of myth for understanding the way that cultures were related one to the other. The idea that myths were transmitted from culture to culture and that there were variants within those myths. Today's lecture will focus on archaeology, science, and ideology. We will look at the way that the material from the ancient Near East was uncovered, deciphered, and organized. And at the conclusion of our lecture, I will refer to some of the ideological debates raging about the subject of the ancient Near East. Though it may seem to be in the distant past, it has relevance for contemporary discourse. We will survey major developments in archaeology in this area and focus on the question of terminology, because early on in the history of archaeology in the Near East, the subject was known as biblical archaeology. And the move away from not terminology and that idea, the move away from a Bible-centered view of the ancient Near East was a very contested one, and one that is still being contested. From ideology, let us move to method. Archaeological method in the ancient Near East depends on two broad concepts and their implementation. The importance of stratigraphy, stratification, and the centrality of pottery. In the early years of archaeology in this area, whether we call it biblical archaeology or ancient Near Eastern archaeology, the focus was on the artifacts, not on the place that they were found. In fact, there was a long period in which scientists, as well as the lay public, were interested in objects. If the objects had writing on them, how much the better. But if they didn't, they could still reveal something about the ancient culture. There was a kind of plunder aspect to this. Western archaeologists going to Middle Eastern countries, taking artifacts and removing them to Western museums. And the great collections of the Louvre in Paris, of the British Museum in London, of American museums such as the Brooklyn Museum in New York, were built up by the removal of artifacts from the ancient Near East. This was facilitated by the cultural and political imperialism of the European powers, which enabled them to take what they wanted. And in the American case, it was facilitated by the growing American wealth and by the nurturing in America of the idea of collecting. In a sense, we, as Americans, were competing with Europeans. If there were great collections of Near Eastern artifacts in Paris and London, there needed to be great collections in New York, Boston, and Washington. We didn't want to be embarrassed in terms of our cultural heritage. So we have this plunder period, or what one of my colleagues refers to as the hunting and gathering period of archaeology. Let's go out there, get the object, bring it back, see what it tells us. As the 19th century closes and the 20th century begins, we move to emphasis on the site, on the place where the object is found. And we have a type of synthesis. The object and the place where that object was found need each other. They don't tell us the whole story unless they have each other. If you have an object and you don't know how it was found, where it was, who uncovered it, you don't really have the whole story. So sites became important. how to investigate sites became the methodological focus of archaeologists. With this focus on sites came an awareness of strata, of levels, an awareness that settlement at many sites in the Near East extended over millennia, and that over time, layers of human habitation were built, one on top of another. And this stratification was the way that tells, spelled T-E-L-S or T-E-L-L-S, tells, the singular tell, were formed. A tell is a settlement mound formed over centuries by successive human habitation. And the Near East is riddled with them, literally thousands of them. Many tells have become famous for what they have revealed about the past. For example, Tel El Amarna in Egypt. Now, that's a modern name for an ancient site, the site of Akhet Aten, the city of the horizon of the Aten, the city of Akhenaten, and his queen Nefertiti. The remains of this city were found at the site identified by archaeologists as Tel El Amarna, hence the name Amarna letters, the letters I've referred to a number of times, which show the connections between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Or, on the subject of tells, an example from Mesopotamia, Tel Kuyunjuk, today part of the Iraqi city of Mosul. The first excavations, the first European excavations in Iraq began there in the 1840s, and slowly this tell gave up its secrets. It was the Assyrian city of Nineveh. On it was the palace of Sennacherib, the 7th century BC king, renowned as the destroyer of Babylon. Nineveh was a name that also evoked a connection to the Bible. And here we return to the biblical ancient Near Eastern nexus of interest among Westerners. What was Nineveh? Nineveh was the city to which the prophet Jonah was supposed to go to prophesy. What was his message? In another 40 days, Nineveh will fall if the people don't repent. So readers of the Bible knew about Nineveh. Here, Nineveh was discovered. How exciting. This generated a lot of interest in archaeology. Digging through tells in both Egypt and Mesopotamia and elsewhere in the Near East, archaeologists were able to reconstruct the history of any given settlement, and in this way to trace the rise and fall of city-states. One of the tragedies of the aftermath of the 2003 war in Iraq is the plundering of tells. That is, thousands of archaeological sites have been left unguarded in Iraq, and local thieves, organized in gangs, are going into these tells and digging up the artifacts. And to return to our conversation about sites and artifacts, naturally these thieves are not interested in the site. In fact, by forcibly and hurriedly removing the artifacts, they are destroying the site. But they can take the artifact and sell it. And this is what seems to be important. The importance of tells was very beautifully described by one of the great German Assyriologists, Wolfram von Soden, in this way. They give us an inestimable abundance of material remains, written sources, architecture, and art, all of which tell us about the ancient Near East. So this sequence of settlement, the layers of habitation, have been designated by pottery type. This is the way archaeologists identify the levels of habitation. They name them after the type of pottery. For the pottery of every historical period is distinctive in terms of the composition of the clay, the way that it's shaped, the way that it's baked, and, if it's decorated, the way that it's decorated. Pottery can be shattered, it can be scattered, but it doesn't disintegrate. It hangs around at that level of habitation. So it becomes a clock, a way to tell when the site had human habitation. Pottery production began approximately 8,000 years ago in 6000 BC. Again, very approximately. I'm referring to the beginning of the Neolithic, which occurs at different times in the Near East. And throughout the area, there were the materials to make pottery. We've alluded to this before: water, clay, fuel. There were also pigments, natural dyes with which to dedicate the pottery. Now, not all sites had potters. If there was pottery made, it was kept. But there were sites we refer to as aceramic. There was no pottery, but that's quite rare. Now, as students of the ancient Near East, we need to remember that when we speak of pottery in these sites, this is not an arts and crafts reference. That is, it's not that people had a hobby and they were making pots. Rather, pottery was an essential of civilized life. It was the way that you made drinking vessels, eating vessels. It was the way that you fashioned religious items. The gods were fashioned out of clay. Art was expressed through pottery, yes, but it was functional art. It wasn't art purely for expression. So stratigraphy, the awareness of levels, and the study of pottery, these became the foundations of scientific archaeology. Armed with these techniques, archaeologists found as much interest in the site as in the discovery of artifacts. And from the 1920s and 30s on, we have hundreds of excavations of Near Eastern tells. The ideal in a tell excavation is to go through all of the layers of habitation until you reach the deepest layer. This doesn't always happen because of the exigencies of work and the money and effort that's involved, but that was the ideal set by early archaeologists. In the beginning of archaeology in this area, this cultural area, archaeology and the interest in it in the West was conditioned by what we might call today a biblical worldview. People were interested in it because it could tell them about the Bible. They were familiar with these places, with kings, with religious figures from the Bible. Now the sites of biblical history were being uncovered. How could archaeology tell them about the Bible? Sir Leonard Woolley, the great British archaeologist, excavated at Ur, in which he uncovered the royal cemetery and its spectacular collection of grave goods, including gold jewelry. This caught the imagination of Western readers, and his findings made headlines in newspapers throughout the world. His archaeological excavations were also supported by newspapers because it made good press. Now, an important factor in this press, in this publicity, was the connection to the Bible. It turns out that to Woolley personally, this wasn't that important. He was interested in the artifacts and the sites themselves, but he was a very smart academician and researcher. He knew how to get funding, which is the key to being able to do research. He knew that Ur was familiar to readers of Genesis. It was the city from which Abraham's family came. And those eager to, quote, prove the biblical truth, unquote, which was a common cultural move in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Bible can be proven to be true if we look at archaeology. This made the public want to know more about Ur. Similar, in many ways, to what I was saying about Nineveh. People want to know about Nineveh because Jonah the prophet was sent to Nineveh. So for Woolley and his team, this was a kind of godsend. Furthermore, Woolley, in his excavation reports, said he had found at the lowest level in his tell at Ur and at other places what he called the flood layer, proof that there had been a great flood. We now know there had been many floods in ancient Iraq. That's the nature of the country and of its river valley. But he very wisely focused on this idea of a great flood and universal flood. But what did this remind people of? Naturally, Noah's flood in the Hebrew Bible. Tell us more, they said. And he did. He got more money for excavations, and he told them more. Now today, 70 or so years after these excavations, we know that this is not exactly so. There aren't uniform flood layers. It isn't a sign of a universal flood. But it worked at the time, right? It generated a lot of interest. The Bible in this period, the period I'm speaking of, is the late 19th, early 20th century into the 20s and the 30s when Woolley was working. The Bible was still a basic foundational element in Western culture. Educated Europeans and Americans knew of Mesopotamia because of the Bible. I recall once hearing that in the 19th century, Mesopotamia was considered a religious word. It was uttered with reverence because it evoked the world of biblical history. We've been focusing on Mesopotamia for the past few minutes. What, you may ask, of Egypt? Wasn't there great interest in Egypt and excavation there? Yes, and there actually the biblical connection is less important in generating public funding and interest. Witness the reaction to the discovery in the 1920s of 1923, more precisely, of the tomb of King Tut, Tutankhamun in Egypt. A kind of Tut mania took over the world. Everyone wanted to read about, know about, and emulate the decorations of King Tut. And this is part of what we in Near Eastern studies call Egyptomania, something that seems to grip the West every few years, especially museum goers. They need their fill of some great exhibit from ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt in the West seems to have an inherent interest that is not necessarily connected to the biblical. We have this idea of mysterious Egypt, don't we? There's something mystical, magical about ancient Egypt. There is something very attractive about ancient Egypt, but the more one knows about it, one realizes that it was not exactly magical and mystical. It was eminently practical. But this doesn't stop people from being attracted to it. So let us look a little closer at this differing interest in the West, the difference between the interest in Mesopotamian societies and the interest in Egypt. The West had always known of Egypt. Travelers to Egypt could see the ruins of a great civilization, and in their home cities, museum goers could see its artifacts. There were Egyptian obelisks in many European cities, and there were copies of Egyptian obelisks and monuments in the shape of an obelisk in many American cities. In fact, there's a real Egyptian obelisk in Central Park in New York City. So Egyptomania has been with us for a very long time. Hieroglyphs were an object of fascination to many people. This has been true since the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, there were attempts to decipher hieroglyphs. These attempts were dead wrong. They didn't understand what they were. They took them to be some kind of mystical sign. But that's not really important. What's important for cultural history is that the interest in Egypt stayed with us. It never went away. Let's contrast that with Mesopotamia. The only connection to Mesopotamia for most people in Europe and in the United States was the Bible. Yes, travelers to Iraq might ask where things were. Where was Babylon? But that was because of Babylon of the Bible. Mesopotamia had ruins. The ancient Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians didn't build pyramids. They didn't build great stone monuments. So there were no great remains for travelers to wax romantic over. And in fact, Babylon and Mesopotamia had a negative connotation for many people because the Bible speaks negatively of Babylon. Babylon is a symbol of depravity. We know of the phrase, the whore of Babylon. Babylon, for many contemporary groups, still signifies an evil empire, a corrupt rule. Among the Rastafarians, a contemporary religious group, Babylon symbolizes the idea of exile. They invoke and evoke the words of the Psalms, of the Hebrew Psalms in the Bible. By the waters of Babylon, we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. This is the plaint of the Judean captives in Babylon. So Babylon is bad. Babylon, yes, it evokes the Bible, but it's the empire that's supposed to fall and supposed to have been destroyed. Americans, collectors, archaeologists, academicians, were pioneers in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, and especially in this connection between the archaeology and the Bible, in what I've referred to as the hunting and gathering period, the plundering period of archaeology, before the sites themselves became all important. Americans were traveling in the Near East and collecting artifacts. In fact, the father of biblical archaeology, according to many scholars today, is one Edward Robinson, an American professor. He taught in New York at Union Theological Seminary. He traveled to Palestine and the neighboring Near Eastern countries in both 1838 and 1852, surveying sites that he identified as biblical, often identifying them because of the similarity of their names, their present Arabic names to the ancient biblical names. And he produced a map of biblical Palestine that became very influential in the West. His book, Biblical Researches in Palestine, became a bestseller. Now, I don't think this is a title that would be a bestseller today, but it was in the 1850s. In fact, it was one of a number of books, among them Thompson's The Land and the Book, a book influenced by Robinson, which were great American bestsellers, by which I mean that they sold hundreds of thousands of copies. In fact, the only book that competed with them before the Civil War was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Otherwise, this is what the American public wanted to read about: discovery of the biblical world in the ancient Near East. Robinson and other explorers were clergymen. So when they came back to the United States, they taught at seminaries, they preached in churches, and the artifacts they brought back were often donated to seminaries. Hence, we have the establishment of great collections, such as the one originally at Andover Theological Seminary, which is now in the Harvard Semitic Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So under Robinson and these other Americans, we have the formation of this biblical archaeology idea. And this idea was extended to all excavation in the Near East. As we move into the 20th century, we have a critique emerging of this idea of biblical archaeology. And the field eventually became known as Near Eastern archaeology, which is the way that the journals in this academic field now refer to the subject. Now, one aspect of this critique mapped on to the Arab-Israeli conflict of the second half of the 20th century. Israel, as the site of many excavations, identified itself as a reborn biblical nation. And here I want to tie this in to the subject of referring modern nationalisms to ancient Near Eastern realities. So Israel, like Egypt, like Turkey, like Iraq, referred itself to the ancient world, and the biblical component of Israel identity was highlighted. And archaeology became a very important subject in the national consciousness of Israelis. And in the West, in the second half of the 20th century. This is the way that many Westerners understood Israel. They understood it as the Holy Land, and archaeology in that place as biblical archaeology. Now, this view, equating archaeology in the Near East with biblical archaeology, was objectionable to many supporters of the Arab states. So the subject became politicized. It became part of the conflict. Another aspect of this debate about terminology, should this be called Near Eastern archaeology or biblical archaeology, was the question of the inherent interest of the materials taken from the Near East. Scholars asked, were these objects and sites of interest only because of what they could tell us about a world we had already heard about, the Bible? Is that their primary importance? Or do they have an interest that's intrinsic to them? Is there something we can learn from these societies themselves, independent of the biblical connection? So this became a very heated subject, and I should say it still is a very heated subject. Inherent interest. This could encompass the history, the aesthetics, the origins of writing, the development of the first cities, the origins of science, especially astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. All of these originate in the Near East. Aren't these, people said, reason enough to study this material? We don't necessarily need to look at it through a biblical lens. This question of inherent interest was especially true of public discourse about writing, about the invention of writing. By the mid-19th century, both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform had been deciphered, and Western scholars identified the Near East as the cradle of civilization, a term which we will evoke many times in this series. The texts of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Canaanites, and others revealed a rich cultural history that encompassed all aspects of civilized life as we know it, including the aspect of technology, how to make things, how things work, where they originated from. This was a very powerful interest among the peoples of the ancient Near East. Now, an earlier Western model of civilization saw it as the product of the Greeks and the Romans. And this still is a component of our education today. The basis of our civilization is in Greece and Rome. One still hears this. A newer model, to my thinking, a more accurate and fair model, is that the ancient Near Eastern cultures were the predecessors of the Greeks and the Romans, and they made those accomplishments, the Greek and Roman accomplishments, possible. And this is not only in the realm of theory, but it's actually what the Greeks and Romans said. They ascribed many of their inventions to the ancients, to the people of Egypt, Mesopotamia. When we think of the alphabet, the product of Eastern Mediterranean culture, the product of the Middle East, we think of a cultural contribution that was spread from the Middle East by the Phoenicians to the Greeks. That is, it went from the east to the west. So we could see that the history of writing presents us with an area of study which has intrinsic interest. It is not necessarily linked to the Bible. So in the second half of the 20th century, we find a shift from this biblical connection to a more considered connection of Near Eastern archaeology as intrinsically valuable. Along with that, we find a shift from the classical European interest in elites, nobles, the kings of the ancient Near East, to an interest in commoners, an interest in what people ate, how they lived, and what they believed.